It's hard to realize upfront when it comes to styling a website. Forms are pretty much the worst part. So it's not just the users who hate them, the developers hate them too. In case you are wondering why is that so, well, it's because of density. Forms have the highest density of elements per square inch than any other area. Well, it all depends on the kind of website, and I might be exaggerating a little bit, but forms are a critical and essential part of any proper website, and there is no running away from them. So let's take the bull by the horn and make a styled web form. I am Ali from Learn Awesome channel, and in this video we shall focus on creating and styling an HTML signup form. We would be focusing on styling the form rather than the form elements, so I would strongly encourage that if you haven't seen part 1 of our definitive guide to HTML forms and input controls video, please pause and do so, where we covered web form in detail and created an unstyled form with almost all input elements covered. Just saying, I'll describe the individual elements less and focus on styling more here. So let's switch to Visual Studio Code now and get started. Let's start by creating a skeleton HTML document, but first let me show you a form that was created in our last video. As you can see, it covers all the functional pieces and almost all conceivable input elements, but if I use it in a proper website, I won't have happy users, if any users at all after a while. Now, every developer has a way of doing things in a specific way. Some people first get all the functional pieces covered and then focus on styling. Some focus on thinking how the form should look like and then start off. In my humble opinion, there's no right or wrong way. It always takes a couple of iterations to take a final shape. Once a form takes shape, some aspects or requirements for addition or subtraction always creep in. I would argue that form is part of a website or web page which should always first be designed on paper or drawing first, reviewed, and then coded up. This is specifically true for CSS and styling since making major design changes post form creation results not only in extra work, but there's always a chance of errors since you won't give as much thought to redesign as you did when you first took design decisions for the form. If it doesn't make sense right now, just remember and recall these words at end of the video and hopefully it will. Okay, enough lecture. So for our case, we are going to extend the existing form in shape of a sign-up form, keeping some of the sections intact. So there's going to be a personal information section, an account section, followed by an additional information section. We also don't like this irregular sizing of input elements, so we'll try to address that too. Let's start by creating an HTML document and adding our first section for personal information and add some elements to it. Okay, we have our skeleton for our document ready. Right, let's add a form element, form. Let's give it a dummy host for now. And describe that we are going to use a post method. Now I'm going to add the first section for personal information using the field set element, which creates a box with a title. Okay, and now let's give it a title using the legend element. Let me bring up the preview. Yes. So here we can see our form taking shape using the live preview extension from Microsoft. Right, let's add our first input element with the label. So label for equal to first name. Yeah, just to recall, the ID is the identifier for the first name, which would be we would be using in CSS and also used in the label for attribute. And name is something that is used when the form information is sent to the server. So the data that gets sent to the server would contain this name, this user first name equal to the value entered in the form, not the ID. So just remember that part. This is really important. So we are going to revisit this one. So I'm going to copy paste this for the last name, make some changes. Good. Form looking good so far without any styling changes. All right, let's keep going and add a date of birth, date time element as well. So, oh, we didn't needed it in the label. All right, good. Last element that we are going to add would be a picture element. So we are going to ask the user to provide their picture for the profile. So let's do that quickly as well. And for this, we are going to use a file element, file input element. Next, let's spice things up a bit by adding some radio buttons to the form. So complete this one. And for this, we are going to add a div. Have a gender radio buttons. Okay, again, remember, name is something that gets sent when the form is submitted along with this value, not the ID. ID is used in CSS and HTML for selection purposes. So let me add two more. Okay, let me copy paste both of these lines. Changes. And to be politically correct, let's add an other section as well, other radio button as well. Good. So our personal information section is now complete. This is how it looks like. And as you can see, not pretty, it looks pretty much like the form that I showed you earlier that we intended to fix. But so far, it's taking shape just like that one. So now let's change that by adding some styling to this form. And for that, I'm going to add a CSS file, and I'm going to keep the same name, just the extension would be different. Let's link them up in the head section. So okay, just to quickly check if it's working. Uh, yes, it's working. Okay. All right, let's start our styling. And I know it's a bit unfair that we are styling using CSS without covering CSS property in our course playlist, but I'll cover the styling aspects I'm using and we'll cover CSS in a future video in detail. So let's start with some basics. Each element in HTML has a display style that describes its behavior, and primary ones are inline and block. An element with block display style takes entire width of container by default, appears in its own line, with an adjustable width which you can control using width property. In contrast are inline elements which just take the necessary width of their content and let other elements appear on their side. We can't control their width as it is controlled by width of the contents, like almost all elements in our personal information section are inline, and you can see they are appearing side by side, allowing next elements to creep in. Just take note of this part about block elements taking entire row and having adjustable width, and inline elements taking only necessary space for themselves with no adjustable width. The regular HTML rendering called normal flow would pick elements one by one from the top. If it's a block element, it gives it its own row. And if inline, it checks whether previous element was block, in which case the current element is placed on a new line. Otherwise, it is placed next to previous element if space allows. This is normal flow, which essentially is good for all elements. Now, there's a CSS trick to override this normal flow by using something called a float property with values left and right, which essentially dictates to HTML that, hey, this element would appear to left or right of its container, whether normal flow allows it or not. Browser would be forced to pin the element left or right depending on value of float property. Now here comes the fun part. Float has an interesting side effect that it kind of switches the display style of element it is applied on, usually to block. This is complicated as float element does not occupy the entire row though, but does allow you to control the width of element now. This is the most relevant part of entire discussion. We can now control width of an inline element using the width property. I'm sure your head would be spinning now, so let's end the theory part and apply the style and see what happens, and it would make more sense. So we are back in Visual Studio Code. Now I'm going to apply this float property on the label element of our personal information section, and let's see what happens. To do that, I'm going to pick the ID of the personal information section, use a hash followed by the ID to make a CSS selector, and followed by an arrow sign, which would mean all labels within this container identified with this ID now would have the CSS style I'm about to write. And the style I'm about to write is float left. And keep an eye on the preview part and you would see some changes happening. Okay, now all the label elements in this personal information section are floating left, right? I wish we could make it more distinct. Now let's see. If I type left completely, any labels which were appearing like which were being squeezed in the previous row now would appear on the left side of their own respective rows. See? Okay, now that part is clear. Now we are going to use a sister property of float called clear, which is going to ensure that no element is appearing on the left side of the floating element. Because if we have two float elements in a container, then they appear side by side on the side that they are. So let's say I had two inline text in the container with both the float left. So they would appear to pinned to the left of the container but side by side. So clear left ensures that it doesn't happen. All right, so now since we have the ability to assign a specific width to the label element, so that is what I'm going to do now. And I'm going to say a label is now 150 pixel wide. See, the label is now taking 150 pixels in width, which means it's going to push any following inline elements to the right. All right, while we are at it, let's also ensure all the text alignment is to the left side. Okay, next up we are going to add some vertical spacing between these labels because they are very jumbled up and don't look really good. So I'm going to add a margin top property here, which is going to add a margin at the top of all of these elements, all the label elements. So I'm going to call it, let's say 6 pixels. Okay, and okay, refreshing made it work. But there is something odd. The vertical spacing between the labels did increase, but now they are out of alignment with these. In fact, they are actually worse if you um, okay, it's not that visible right now. But the problem right now is that the labels are floating left and they are pinned to the left of the container, but the input elements are not. So they are appearing in the normal flow of things. So if there was additional space here, I could show you that they are going to stack side by side to each other if I leave it like this. So the way to handle it is that I need to apply a float left on these input elements as well, which is going to fix this problem. And I cannot reuse the same selector here because we are adding this width 150 pixel, which is not required for the input element. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a copy of this selector above and let me make it shorter so it's visible. And I'm going to change it to input. Okay. And here I'm going to apply the same float left on the input element. And if I now get smaller, see the horizontal spacing is appearing between the input elements as well. All right. Another thing that we can do right now is there is still a discrepancy between the widths of these input elements. So what we can do is we can either go ahead and assign a width, let's say 200 pixels to all of these, which is going to fix that problem. Now all of these are of the same size, but it's a bit bigger. But if I make it smaller, it works. But a better way is that we know that we have assigned 150 pixels to this label element, right? So we can use a dynamic width here with using a calc property, which is kind of a calculator kind of thing, which where we can calculate the width in a restricted way. It's not a very dynamic one, but still useful. So what we are going to do is we are going to calculate 100% width, which assigns a full container width to this input element space. And remember, this positioning is very important. There shouldn't be any space between calc and opening braces, and there must be a space between the first argument and second argument. So 100% minus 150 pixels, and they should be, that should work, but it's not working. And why? Because 150 pixel only caters for the width of this label. In fact, let me show you. If I make it file, save all, and open this, let me open inspect. Okay, and let's inspect this input element that we were assigning the value to. And notice if I hover over this, you see this colorful border appearing around the input element. They must be margin or there are three things involved between in the width of an element in addition to other elements in the container area, which are margin, padding, and border. So margin sits outside the element and other elements around it. Border is the actual border around the element like this. And padding is the gap between border of the element and its contents. So, and this is displayed visually in browsers like Chrome. So if let's say I have this input element in focus and if I scroll all the way down in the styles tab, we can actually see that it has zero margin, but it has a 2 pixel border, which we can visibly see, and it has 2 pixel padding on its side as well. So when we do the calculation and in the calc expressions, the second argument must take into account not only the width of the label element, which was 150 pixels, and but also the border and padding, horizontal border and horizontal padding of this input element. So this is 2 plus 2 on this side and 2 plus 2 on this side. So total 8 pixels, which need to be added up to that calculation expression. So if we go back and make it not 150 pixels but 158 pixels, and yes, we can see it right here, it's taking shape. And if we go back to Chrome and do a refresh operation, see, they are all adjusting nicely, except for this date of birth, which is causing some trouble here. So what's wrong with this one? All right, let's see. So if we inspect this, okay, so we see that it has a 2 pixel border, but only a 1 pixel border, 1 pixel padding on only one side. So there is a 3 pixel discrepancy between padding of the other input elements and that of the date of birth. It's slightly different to accommodate these icons and everything. So there are multiple ways to do it. One is that we can remove padding from, we can make the padding consistent. So, right, so what we are going to do is we are going to add a 2 pixel padding on each side to all of these elements. And hopefully that should fix the problem. So if I go here and say padding left 2 pixel and padding right 2 pixels and now save, right, you see all elements are now equally spaced, right, with no visible damage done to the padding element. We could also define a separate CSS selector for that particular input element, but we chose not to do so because for the sake of simplicity at this time, but that is also possible. And since we are on topic, let me show you what would have happened if we hadn't specified this float left or any of these attributes styling on the input elements. So remember I was telling you they would be stacked side by side. So if I uncheck them in Chrome browser tools, which basically make them not applicable. So you see, even though the labels were floating left, the other inline elements were going their merry way like before. appearing side by side in the normal HTML flow. But making the input elements float left fix the problem. And adding width and padding and consistent padding now has resizable form, which has an equidistance sizing for both the label and input elements. Right, one mess up that we still see is this gender area where you can clearly see the styling is not up to the mark, so we need to fix it next. So to do that, we head back to our CSS file. So if you remember, we enclosed this gender and its radio buttons in a div in the HTML file. So let's introduce a class for that div. In fact, let me class equal to radio buttons. Okay. And here we go. We say dot, and dot stands for a class-based selector compared to the hash, which is a ID-based selector. So we gave the class radio buttons to this div. So here we are using a class selector. So we do div, dot radio buttons, right? And here we say, here we use another kind of CSS property which assigns display flex, and you'll see the effect in just a second. And let me just do it. And then I say gap colon 0.5 rem. Right, so assigning a display flex and providing a gap of 0.5 rem creates a kind of a equidistance gap between the elements in the div. So this male, female, other, they are all going to be spaced equidistant to each other. So if I do, let's say 1.5, you see the gap increases. So I think 0.5 is the best compromise value, right? But here's the problem that the float left that we assigned to this top level constructor is not making its way to this gender label, because this gender label does not belong in the personal info field set directly. So that what we did here, it impacted the label elements or the div elements contained directly within the container with this identifier. So to do that, we need to, there are a couple of choices. So the simple choice that we can make is we can add another constructor, radio buttons, and we use the first child selector, which is going to select the first child, which is this label element. And what we are going to do is we are going to assign some value like, yeah, so the first child is going to be this gender label. So we are going to assign a gap after this. And since we are not sure how much space this is taking, so if I do margin right and say 100 pixels, no, it's a bit too far, 90 pixels, no, it's a bit short, so 95, yeah, 95 or 96 appears to work perfectly. It's perfectly aligned now. Perfect. So our form looks great. Let's see that in Chrome as well, just to make sure. So if I go here and see, it looks perfect. It's everything is aligned now and looks great. Apart from a slight issue that these labels are not in direct vertical alignment with these input elements, which we can quickly fix. So I'm gonna change this margin top to 3 pixels and margin bottom to 3 pixels as well. And now they should be perfectly vertical aligned with the input boxes. See, they are. Looks great. We can move on to our next section now, which would be regarding account info. Okay, we are going pretty slow until now, so let's pick up pace and try to do it better time-wise. fields. I'll try to cover as many input types control as possible. Why is it not appearing here? Okay. Okay. Right, we are done with the second section. Time to style it. So the first thing that we are going to do is copy this first line and move this bracket forward, provide a comma here, and do the same for all of these. Okay, and same goes here, comma, and format with Shift Alt F in Visual Studio Code. And great, our section is complete, looks good. Let's check in Chrome. If I press refresh, nothing happened because I never saved the HTML file. If I do it, good. We can see email coming up with placeholders. If we type password, it's doing this, and it should not, it should give an error if we specify a phone number in some incorrect format. Right, since we are picking up speed this time, let's do the additional information section as well as quickly as possible. So let's get to it. I'm going to type it and then we'll talk. Okay, label for equal and name equal to user. Oh, that belonged here. Made a complete mess of it. Okay. Right, we are done. Let's see how it looks. So if I select it, go here. Yeah, pretty bad, right? Okay, let's fix that. So to fix this, we need to go to our style page and make a couple of changes. Okay, first off, we need to specify a new section here. And this time we are going to do something different from the way we have been styling the sections previously. So I'm going to show you another way of doing the same. So it's going to look and feel the same, but the strategy we adopt would be a bit different. So just bear with me. Sorry, what am I doing? HTML info. I'm going to explain everything once I'm done typing. So please bear with me. Okay, let's see how these things look now. Hmm, doesn't look great. What am I forgetting? Sorry, in this technique, you have to, we are not using float left, so we have to provide the line breaks ourselves. So let's do this quickly. Uh, After this, let me copy and paste it everywhere. Label and label behind before all the labels. And let's try it now. Refresh. Looks much better, right? Okay. And you can select your favorite programming language here. We can increase the size of this area. So let's quickly do that. Let's go back to Visual Studio Code and add a section for styling the text area because it doesn't look really good in current form. So I'm just gonna change the width and using calculate 100% minus, well, 160 pixel. Let's see how this looks. And if, in fact, let me just copy this. I told you before, using this keeps this auto refreshing because it's a server address. All right, looks good. The text area is now spanning the entire width, just like all the other input elements. Similarly, we can do this here for this address element. So ideally, all we need to do is add an input entry here, which would apply it on both input and text area. And let's see the result. Something changed, but not that much. Let me see. Does it still work? Yes, it still works. And you must be wondering, why are we having to subtract 162 pixels from 100% when previously we only needed to do 158? And if to do that, you have to look very closely. This start of this input element does not align with this. There is a difference. So how much difference there is? So this is 387 pixels, but this one is 383 pixels. So 4 pixels difference. And where is this difference coming from? Is there any padding? No, the padding is the same on both elements, and the label is doesn't have any padding or border. So where did that gap come into the picture? All right, so the answer lies in the different technique that we used. So if I can go back to CSS, see, we use this inline block display style. And what does inline block do? Inline block kind of sits between an inline element and a block element. And what it does is it lets you specify a height and width on an inline element. So height, width, margin, and paddings, they can all be applied on an inline element if it has a display style of inline blocks, which is exactly what we are doing on the label elements, right? And another difference is that it also lets elements sit side by side. So it doesn't, occupies the entire row. It allows other elements to exist in the same row. So that is why the input elements are being allowed in the same row as this label where this label element exists, right? The downside of inline block is, which is one of the hidden gems of this CSS, is that if there is any character existing between this label element and the element next to it, then there is going to be a space between these two. Doesn't make sense, right? So if you can see this narrow 4 pixel space, let me show you how to remove it. So if I go to the styled HTML form, and where was it? I can actually close that, see, and if I, let's say, even new line is considered a character, remember that. So if I now go back and yeah, it has auto refresh. See, the space is gone between these two elements, the label and now the label sits directly beside these elements, just like these ones, right? But if even if I press enter and go back, see the space has reappeared. So this is one of the things that you need to keep in mind. And the problem is occurring in our form because we are mixing two approaches here. We are using float left, which does not have this problem of gapping between two elements, but inline block does have the tendency to add random, not random, but some space between two consecutive elements. So if we were using the same technique in all of these, then this problem, you might not be seeing them because that would be consistent across these three blocks. But since this is an introductory video, and we are not trying to create a sign up form as such, we are trying to learn to create sign up forms, then you need to be aware of all these techniques and their pros and cons. One really, I don't have a decent word for this. So technique to fix this issue is introduce a negative margin. And margin, as I told you, is a spacing that exists outside the border of an element and other elements, right? So what we are going to do is we are going to introduce a margin of -4 pixel, right? We're going to gobble up that extra space that is being added. And if I go here, see the space between these two, discrepancy between these two are gone. There is no spacing now anymore between this and this. All right. The reason this checkbox is sitting smack in the middle is because we have applied the same width formula for every type of input element. So what we can do is there's another technique. So have, we can in the selector select all input elements except one. And to do that, we use the input colon not operator. And in here, I'm going to say input type equal to checkbox. And now these are not going to be applied on the checkbox. So you see it came back, but it still have that 4 pixel problem. So ideally, it would have to be fixed using using its own selector. We can't do that because we need to apply width. We need to apply this -4 pixel, but not that width thing. And that should fix the problem. So I'm gonna just do a Control Z on that, and that is fine for now. You understand how to fix it. All right, the only thing perhaps left to control is this weird gap, no gap between the select element and the text area element, and the reason being the text area element is not an input element. It's another type of element. And the text area is big. So the gap doesn't really exist. The only way to fix it is introduce selector for the select element, in which we are gonna say we're fine with it being small. So for margin, since we need a margin on both top and left of this element, so what we are going to do is we are going to use the for value way of specifying the margin, and we are going to say 3 pixel, 0 pixel, 0 pixel, and -4 pixel. And these, if we specify four values as the value for margin, they mean top, right, bottom, and left, right? Clockwise. So that's the good way to remember it. Now, if we go, you can see the 3 pixel gap is coming up, and that is now consistent with all the other gaps that exist between the elements. So we are good. Right? If you want to increase its width all the way, you can simply have this width appearing here as well, but we don't need to do so at this time. Right, so I would like to mention here that you can customize the styling of all of these elements individually. So, like if you want to change the color for this checkbox, text style, the date time, everything, but I think we are way past our times, so I won't be going into that detail. The last item that we are going to cover would be the submit button, how to add that. So for that, I would head here to the HTML and I'm going to add a div and call it um, submit container. And inside, I'm going to input type equal to submit. And we are going to call the value equal to submit as well. Right, we head back and the submit button is here, but we need some styling to bring it in the center. And for that, we are just gonna submit button container, and we are going to use the text align property of the container to align their contained items in the center. So if I use center here and go back, did I do a spelling mistake? Oh, it was submit container, not submit button container. All right. All right. So it moved to side a bit, but not all the way to the center. And that is because our div is not, taking entire space of the container. So we can quickly fix this with width 100%. And if we go back, it's smack in the middle now. And we can submit container input, and we can customize like background color. Let's say get it blue. Why isn't it working? Oh my God, I made another spelling mistake. Yes. So here it is. If we go back, yeah, its color is updated. So you can make all sort of changes to the button, its size, shape, corners, radius, color, all kind of CSS styling on the buttons. I'm not gonna go into that rabbit hole at the moment, but every sort of customization is possible. Right? This brings us to end of this video. My objective was to get you familiar with all the concepts that go in styling a web form. It was not meant to be a production ready form, which requires more aesthetic components as well, like background colors and sizing and whatnot. But you know all the basic tools to be able to customize it and add and remove items of your choice. If you would like me to make another video on how to customize these individual items or provide more information about responsive forms and whatnot, please let me know via comments and I'll try to do that as well. All right, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, don't forget to give a thumbs up and subscribing to the channel. Thank you. Goodbye.